In the dusty town of Cedar Ridge, Texas, a weathered cowboy named Colt Ramsey hammered the final nail into a dream that most folks thought was foolish. While other men chased cattle and gold, he'd spent his last dollar and every spare moment building something different, a schoolhouse for 50 children who had nowhere else to turn. The locals whispered he was wasting his time on orphans and ranch hands' kids who'd never amount to much. Then Charlotte Van Buren stepped off the eastbound train, her silk dress and refined manners marking her as railroad royalty. She'd come to oversee her father's business, but what she discovered in that humble one-room school would challenge everything she believed about worth, purpose, and the power of an ordinary man's extraordinary vision. But when her father's railroad threatens to destroy everything Colt has built, will Charlotte choose family loyalty or the cowboy who dared to dream? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Cedar Ridge as Colt Ramsey stood in the doorway of his newly completed schoolhouse, a worn leather Bible tucked under his arm. The book had belonged to his father, its pages yellowed with age and margins filled with careful notes in faded ink. Between the pages of Psalms, pressed wildflowers from his mother's garden still held their delicate shape, though their colors had long since faded to sepia memories. Colt ran his calloused fingers along the Bible's spine, feeling the familiar comfort of cracked leather that had traveled countless miles in saddlebags and survived more hardships than most men could endure. This book had been his companion through the darkest years after his parents' death, when he drifted from ranch to ranch, carrying nothing but grief and a growing anger at the world's indifference to suffering. But that was before Cedar Ridge, before he'd seen 50 children with nowhere to go and nothing to hope for. The town itself sat like a forgotten thought in the vast expanse of Texas plains, its weathered buildings clustered around a single dirt road that led either to somewhere better or nowhere at all, depending on a person's perspective. Cedar Ridge had been born from necessity rather than ambition, a way station for cattle drives, a place to rest and resupply before pushing on to more prosperous destinations. Most folks who ended up here weren't chasing dreams. They were running from nightmares or simply too tired to keep moving. The children Colt had taken under his wing came from every corner of that hard reality. There was 12-year-old Sarah Mitchell, whose parents had died of fever the previous winter, leaving her to care for her twin brothers with nothing but determination and the charity of neighbors who could barely feed their own families. Hernandez's children Maria, Pablo, and little Isabella had been left behind when their father went looking for work in the railroad camps and never returned. Their mother had taken sick and died the following spring, leaving 3 orphans who spoke more Spanish than English and trusted no one. Then there were the working children, boys like Tommy Henderson, whose father hired him out to neighboring ranches for 50 cents a day, and girls like Ruth Caldwell, who cleaned houses and tended babies while their own childhood slipped away like water through cupped hands. Some of the children were legitimate. Others bore the quiet shame of unclear parentage in a society that punished the innocent for the sins of their elders. What united them all was hunger, not just for food, though that was real enough, but for something more lasting. Colt had seen it in their eyes during his first months in Cedar Ridge, that hollow look of children who'd learned too young that the world was harsh and hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. He'd arrived in town 18 months ago, another drifter with a horse, a few dollars, and skills that were useful anywhere cattle needed managing. But something about Cedar Ridge had caught hold of him. Maybe the way the sunset painted the plains in shades of gold and amber, or how the wind carried the scent of wild grass and distant possibilities. More likely, it was the children. Colt had never planned to be a teacher. Hell, he'd barely had schooling himself, just enough to read his father's Bible and cipher numbers well enough to avoid being cheated at the trading post. But when he'd seen Sarah Mitchell trying to teach her little brothers their letters, by scratching shapes in the dirt with a stick. Something had stirred in him that felt suspiciously like purpose. The idea had grown slowly, the way good ideas often do. First, he'd started helping Sarah with her brothers, teaching them to write their names and work simple sums. Then word had spread, and other parents, or in many cases, older siblings serving as reluctant guardians, began bringing their children around. Before he knew it, Colt was holding informal lessons under the shade of the massive oak tree that stood at the edge of town. Building the actual schoolhouse had been another matter entirely. Lumber was expensive, and Colt's savings from his ranch work wouldn't stretch far enough to buy what he needed. But Cedar Ridge had its share of decent folks, and slowly, materials had begun to appear. Jim Patterson, who ran the general store, donated nails and hinges that had been gathering dust in his storeroom. The widow Murphy contributed curtain fabric that had been meant for a house she'd never been able to afford. Most importantly, other men had donated their time and labor, working evenings and weekends to raise the walls and lay the floor. Not everyone had supported the project, of course. Mayor Welland thought it was a waste of resources that could be better spent attracting businesses to the town. Several of the more prosperous ranchers questioned the wisdom of educating children who were, in their opinion, destined for lives of manual labor regardless of their schooling. But enough people had believed in the dream to make it reality. The schoolhouse itself was modest by any standard, a single room with rough-hewn benches, a wood-burning stove, and a blackboard that Colt had painted directly onto one wall. The windows were real glass, a luxury that had cost him 2 months' wages. But he'd figured children deserved to learn in proper light. A hand-carved sign above the door proclaimed Cedar Ridge School, in letters that weren't perfectly straight, but were filled with the kind of care that mattered more than precision. This morning, as Colt prepared for his first official day as schoolmaster, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew his attention toward the main road. A small dust cloud marked the progress of what appeared to be a private carriage, an unusual sight in Cedar Ridge, where most folks traveled by horseback or on foot. The carriage was clearly expensive, its black paint gleaming despite the dust of travel, and pulled by a matched pair of bay horses that spoke of careful breeding and generous feeding. As it drew closer, Colt could make out the figure of a woman, seated inside, her posture erect, and her clothing obviously tailored for someone with means. The carriage pulled up in front of Murphy's boarding house, and the driver, a serious-looking man in a dark suit, climbed down to open the passenger door. The woman who emerged was like nothing Cedar Ridge had seen before. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue silk, its cut and quality marking her as someone from back east, probably one of the big cities. Her dark hair was pinned in an elaborate style, beneath a small hat adorned with feathers, and her gloved hands moved with the practiced grace of someone accustomed to being watched and judged. But it was her eyes that caught Colt's attention as she paused to survey the town. They held intelligence and something else, perhaps disappointment or resignation. She looked like a woman who'd arrived somewhere she didn't particularly want to be. Charlotte Van Buren had indeed arrived somewhere she didn't want to be, though she was far too well-bred to let such feelings show on her face. The journey from Philadelphia had been long and uncomfortable, despite the luxury of her father's private railroad car for most of the trip. This final leg, traveling by hired carriage from the nearest railroad depot, had been particularly trying, and the sight of Cedar Ridge did little to improve her spirits. The town was exactly what she'd expected, and hoped she wouldn't find a dusty collection of weathered buildings that seemed to huddle together for protection against the vast emptiness of the Texas plains. There was no elegance here, no refinement, nothing that reminded her of the world she knew and understood. This was the frontier in all its raw, unforgiving reality. Charlotte had been raised in a world of dinner parties and opera performances, charity balls, and carefully orchestrated social gatherings where every word was measured and every gesture carried meaning. Her education had been thorough and expensive, designed to prepare her for marriage to someone of suitable station and a life spent managing household staff and hosting gatherings that would advance her husband's business interests. But life, she'd discovered, rarely followed the careful plans laid out by finishing schools and well-meaning parents. At 26, she remained unmarried despite her father's increasingly obvious attempts at matchmaking. The problem wasn't lack of suitors. Her family's railroad fortune attracted plenty of interested men, but rather her growing sense that the life laid out before her was somehow insufficient. Her father, Cornelius Van Buren, had built his wealth by connecting distant places with ribbons of steel, bringing civilization and commerce to corners of the country that had previously known only isolation. He was a man of vision and determination, qualities that Charlotte admired even when she questioned his methods. But recently, she'd begun to wonder if progress always required the destruction of what came before. This trip to Texas was meant to be educational, a chance for Charlotte to see firsthand how her father's business operated in the field. She was expected to observe the surveying process, meet with local officials, and report back on the feasibility of the proposed route extension. It was, her father had explained, important for her to understand the family business, since she would likely inherit a significant portion of it someday. What he hadn't said, but what Charlotte understood perfectly well, was that this assignment was also a test. Her father was growing older, and he needed to know that his daughter could be trusted with serious responsibilities. If she proved herself capable in Texas, greater opportunities would follow. If she failed, or if she proved too squeamish for the realities of business, her role would remain decorative dot as Charlotte made her way into Murphy's boarding house, nodding politely to the proprietress while secretly dismaying at the simple furnishings and plain fare that would be her lot for the foreseeable future. She caught sight of the schoolhouse across the way. The building was small and clearly built from whatever materials had been available, but something about it struck her as oddly touching. A sign above the door identified it as Cedar Ridge School, and through the open windows she could hear the sound of children's voices raised in what sounded like a recitation lesson. Despite her fatigue and general displeasure with her circumstances, Charlotte found herself curious about this unexpected symbol of civilization in what she'd assumed would be an entirely uncivilized place. Perhaps there was more to Cedar Ridge than met the eye. Perhaps this assignment would prove more interesting than she'd anticipated. And perhaps, though she didn't yet know it, her life was about to change in ways that no finishing school could have prepared her for. 3 days after Charlotte's arrival in Cedar Ridge, she stood at the edge of town, watching a crew of railroad surveyors drive red-painted wooden stakes into the hard ground. Each stake marked a precise point along the proposed route that would bring the Van Buren Railroad through this corner of Texas, connecting the scattered communities to the larger network of commerce and communication that her father was weaving across the continent. The surveyor in charge, a efficient man named Henderson, who'd worked for the railroad for 15 years, consulted his instruments and called out measurements to his assistants. Charlotte watched the process with the detached interest of someone observing a familiar procedure, until Henderson's voice carried across the morning air with words that made her blood run cold. "Drive the next stake right there, boys. Dead center of that schoolhouse lot." Charlotte felt her heart skip as she followed, Henderson's pointing finger to the small building where she'd been hearing children's voices each morning. The red stake would mark the exact path the railroad would take, and anything in that path would have to be moved or destroyed. "Mr. Henderson," she called, hurrying across the uneven ground toward the surveyor. "Are you certain about that placement?" Henderson looked up from his transit, squinting in the bright Texas sun. "Yes, Miss Van Buren. The route's been calculated to minimize grade changes and maximize efficiency. That schoolhouse sits right where the rails need to go." Charlotte stared at the small building, imagining it reduced to a pile of lumber and broken dreams. Through the open windows, she could hear a man's voice, presumably the teacher leading the children through what sounded like arithmetic lessons. The voices were young and eager, filled with the kind of enthusiasm that came from discovering new knowledge. "Has anyone informed the schoolmaster?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Henderson shrugged. "That's not my job, miss. I just mark where the tracks go. Someone from the company will handle the legal side of things once we file our survey." The legal side of things. Charlotte knew exactly what that meant. Her father's company would make a fair offer for the property fair by railroad standards, which often bore little resemblance to what land might be worth to the people who lived on it. If the offer was refused, the railroad had legal mechanisms to acquire the property anyway. It was all perfectly legitimate, and it happened with such regularity that most railroad employees gave it no more thought than they'd give to ordering lunch. But standing here, listening to the sound of children learning, Charlotte found she couldn't view it with such professional detachment. This wasn't just a property acquisition. It was the destruction of something that someone had clearly worked very hard to create. That evening, Charlotte found herself walking past the schoolhouse just as the day's lessons were ending. Children of various ages emerged from the building, their voices bright with conversation as they headed home to evening chores and simple suppers. She watched them go, noting how they moved with purpose rather than the aimless wandering she might have expected from youngsters in such a remote place. The schoolmaster emerged last, and Charlotte got her first clear look at the man who'd built this place. He was tall and lean, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent most of his life outdoors. His clothes were clean but clearly mended, and he moved with the careful economy of motion that came from hard work and limited resources. What struck her most, though, was the way he stood in his doorway, watching his students head home with the expression of a man who'd found something worth protecting. This, then, was Colt Ramsey. Charlotte had heard his name mentioned in town, always with a mixture of respect and puzzlement. Respect for his dedication to the children, puzzlement at his willingness to spend his own money and time on a project that would never bring him profit. As if sensing her gaze, Colt looked in her direction. For a moment, their eyes met across the dusty space between the schoolhouse and the road, and Charlotte felt an unexpected flutter of something that might have been guilt or curiosity or something else entirely. Colt touched the brim of his hat in a polite gesture of acknowledgement, and Charlotte found herself walking toward the school before she'd consciously decided to do so. "Good evening," she said as she approached the schoolhouse steps. "I'm Charlotte Van Buren. I believe you're Mr. Ramsey?" Colt nodded, his expression politely cautious. "That's right, ma'am. You're with the railroad folks, I'm told." "I am," Charlotte hesitated, suddenly uncertain how to proceed. "I wondered if I might ask you about your school. It's quite an undertaking for a town this size." Something in Colt's expression warmed slightly. "Would you like to see inside? I'm mighty proud of what we've accomplished here." Charlotte followed him into the schoolhouse, immediately struck by the care that had gone into every detail. The benches were rough but sturdy, arranged to give each child a clear view of the blackboard. Books, not many, but well chosen lined. Shelves built into the walls. The floor was swept clean, and someone had taken the trouble to hang cheerful curtains at the windows. "How many children do you teach?" Charlotte asked, running her finger along one of the benches and feeling the smooth wood that had been carefully sanded to prevent splinters. 50, give or take, depending on the season. More in winter when there's less work for them to do. Some are as young as 5, others nearly grown. Some come every day, others just when they can spare the time from helping their families. Charlotte picked up one of the slate boards from a bench, noting the carefully formed letters that some child had practiced over and over. "What do you teach them?" "Reading, writing, arithmetic. A bit of history and geography when I can manage it. Mostly. I try to teach them that they're capable of more than they might think. Colt paused, then added quietly, "Most of these children have been told their whole lives that they're not worth much. I aim to prove otherwise." Charlotte set down the slate board, feeling the weight of knowledge she carried like a stone in her chest. "Mr. Ramsey, I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Colt's expression grew still, and Charlotte realized he'd been expecting this conversation, or one like it. "The railroad survey," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "The proposed route runs directly through this property. The schoolhouse ... it's going to have to be moved or ... torn down." Colt finished the sentence she couldn't bring herself to complete. He moved to the window and stood looking out at the stakes that marked his school's destruction. "I figured as much when I saw those red markers going up." Charlotte was surprised by the steadiness of his voice. She'd expected anger or at least argument. Instead, Colt seemed to be absorbing the news with the resignation of a man who'd faced disappointment before. "There will be compensation, of course," she said quickly. "My father's company always makes fair offers for properties that Miss Van Buren," Colt interrupted gently, "what would you consider fair compensation for 50 children's futures?" The question hit Charlotte like a physical blow. She'd come prepared to discuss property values and relocation costs, not to weigh the worth of dreams against the demands of progress. "I don't know," she admitted, and realized it was the first completely honest thing she'd said since arriving in Cedar Ridge. Colt turned from the window to face her, and Charlotte saw something in his eyes that made her want to look away, not anger, which she could have understood and defended against, but a deep sadness that seemed to encompass more than just the loss of a building. "I built this place with my own hands, Miss Van Buren. Every board, every nail, every inch of it. But that's not what makes it valuable. What makes it valuable is what happens here every day. Children who thought they'd never learn to read are writing letters to relatives they haven't seen in years. Boys who figured they'd spend their lives digging ditches are learning. They might become clerks or bookkeepers, or even teachers themselves. Girls who expected nothing but drudgery are discovering they have minds worth cultivating." Charlotte found herself unable to speak. In her world, progress was always good, and progress meant railroads, industry, and the gradual taming of wild places. She'd never considered that progress might sometimes require the destruction of things that were already good. "How long do we have?" Colt asked, his voice still steady. "The legal paperwork will take several weeks to process. After that..." Charlotte trailed off, unwilling to put a specific timeline on the demolition of everything this man had worked to create. Colt nodded slowly. "Then I'd best make the most of the time we have left." As Charlotte walked back to the boarding house that evening, she found herself thinking not about railroad routes and property acquisitions, but about the sound of children's voices raised in eager recitation. For the first time in her life, she wondered if her father's vision of progress might be incomplete. The red stakes stood like accusers in the gathering dusk, marking the path of a future that suddenly seemed far less certain than it had that morning. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a question was forming that would change everything. What if there was a way to have both progress and preservation? What if the railroad and the school didn't have to be enemies? But that night, such questions were just whispers of possibility. The stakes were planted, the course was set, and in a matter of weeks, Colt Ramsey's school would be nothing but a memory. Despite the red stakes marking its doom, the Cedar Ridge School continued its daily rhythm as if nothing had changed. Colt had made a decision the night after Charlotte's visit. He would teach every day until the last possible moment, giving his students every hour of education he could manage before the inevitable end. The morning after learning about the railroad's plans, he stood before his 50 students holding a cracked slate board in his weathered hands. The slate had belonged to a child named Benjamin Murphy, who died of pneumonia the previous winter before he could finish learning to write his own name. His mother had donated the slate to the school, along with his few books, saying that Benjamin would have wanted other children to have the chance he'd lost. Now, as Colt watched 10-year-old Maria Hernandez carefully form the letters of her name on that same slate, he felt the weight of time pressing against him like a physical force. How many more times would Maria get to practice her letters? How many more arithmetic lessons could he squeeze into the weeks remaining before the railroad claimed his place? "Very good, Maria," he said gently, kneeling beside her bench. "Your letters are getting much straighter. Your mother would be proud." Maria beamed at the praise, her small face lighting up with the kind of joy that came from accomplishment earned through effort. She'd been one of his most challenging students when she'd first arrived, speaking little English and convinced that school wasn't meant for girls like her. Now she was reading simple sentences and helping her younger siblings with their own lessons. From across the room, Charlotte Van Buren watched this exchange through the schoolhouse window. She'd taken to observing the school during her morning walks, telling herself it was simple curiosity about frontier education methods. In truth, she was drawn by something she couldn't quite name, perhaps the patient kindness in Colt's voice as he worked with each child, or the way the students responded to his gentle encouragement. She'd grown up with tutors who'd been hired for their credentials and dismissed for their failures. Education, in her world, was a transaction, knowledge purchased and delivered according to schedule. But what she witnessed here was different. This felt more like a family than a classroom, with Colt serving as a combination of teacher, father, figure, and gentle guide. As Charlotte watched, a small commotion arose near the back of the room. Tommy Henderson, a wiry 12-year-old whose father sent him to work on neighboring ranches whenever money was tight, was struggling with his arithmetic lesson. His frustration was evident in the way he gripped his pencil and the deepening furrow between his eyebrows. "I can't do it," Tommy muttered, his voice carrying the edge of anger that often masked deeper hurt. "Numbers don't make sense. Pa says I'm too stupid for book learning anyway." Charlotte expected Colt to correct the boy sharply, or perhaps assign additional practice problems. Instead, the teacher simply pulled up a chair beside Tommy's bench and sat down. "Tommy," Colt said quietly, "how many head of cattle did you help move last week when you worked for Mr. Patterson?" 43, Tommy answered automatically. "And how many did you count in the west pasture versus the east pasture?" 26 in the west, 17 in the east. So if Mr. Patterson wanted to move all the cattle from the west pasture to join the ones in the east, how many total would he have? Tommy's face scrunched in concentration for a moment before clearing with understanding. 43 total. Same as we moved. "That's right. You just did arithmetic, Tommy. You added 26 and 17 in your head and got 43. The only difference between that and what's on this paper is that the paper uses different words for the same ideas. You already understand." Charlotte found herself leaning closer to the window, fascinated by this approach to teaching. In her experience, education was about memorizing facts and rules. But Colt was connecting new knowledge to what Tommy already knew, building bridges between the boy's practical experience and abstract concepts. The lesson continued for another hour, with Colt moving patiently from student to student, adapting his teaching to each child's needs and background. Charlotte noted how he used farming examples for the children from agricultural families, cattle references for those from ranching backgrounds, and household analogies for the girls who helped their mothers with domestic work. When the morning session ended and the children scattered to their various obligations, Charlotte found herself approaching the schoolhouse once again. She'd told herself she would limit her interactions with Colt Ramsey to what was necessary for her railroad business, but curiosity was proving stronger than professional prudence. "Miss Van Buren," Colt said as he emerged from the school, carrying an armload of slates that needed cleaning. "I didn't expect to see you again so soon." "I was observing your teaching methods," Charlotte said, then immediately regretted the formal tone of her words. "I mean, I was curious about how you manage such a diverse group of students." Something in Colt's expression softened. "Would you like to help me clean these slates? We could talk while we work." Charlotte glanced down at her traveling dress, practical by her standards, but still silk, and then at the dusty slates. "I'm not sure I'm dressed for manual labor." "Neither was I when I started teaching," Colt said with a slight smile. "But I learned that getting your hands dirty is part of most worthwhile work." Against her better judgment, Charlotte found herself following Colt to the small well behind the schoolhouse. He handed her a damp cloth and showed her how to clean the slate surface without damaging the wooden frame. "You have an unusual teaching style," Charlotte observed as she worked. "Very different from my own education." "What was your education like?" Colt asked, genuinely curious. Charlotte paused in her cleaning, considering how to explain a world of private tutors, finishing schools, and carefully structured curricula. Formal, structured, very focused on proper deportment and cultural accomplishments. "I learned French, piano, watercolor painting, and enough literature to make intelligent conversation at dinner parties." "Sounds useful in its way," Colt said without judgment. "Different from what these children need, though." "What do they need?" Colt was quiet for a moment, focusing on scrubbing stubborn chalk marks from a slate. "Hope, mostly. These children have been told their whole lives that they're not worth investing in. They need to believe that their minds matter, that they're capable of growth and change." Charlotte watched his careful hands as he worked, noting the patience with which he removed every trace of the day's lessons to prepare for tomorrow's learning. "Is that why you built the school? To give them hope?" "I built it because I know what it's like to grow up thinking you don't matter." The words came out quietly, almost accidentally, and Charlotte sensed she was hearing something Colt rarely shared. "What do you mean?" Colt set down his slate and looked out across the plains that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. "My parents died when I was 14. Fever took them both in the same week. I had nowhere to go, no family to take me in. Spent the next 10 years drifting from place to place, working whatever jobs I could find, never staying anywhere long enough to matter to anyone." Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest as she imagined a 14-year-old version of this man, alone and adrift in an unforgiving world. "What changed?" she asked softly. "I got tired of not mattering. Tired of being just another drifter that people forgot as soon as I moved on. When I came to Cedar Ridge and saw all these children in the same situation I'd been in, forgotten, dismissed, treated like they were disposable, I realized I could change that. Maybe not for myself, but for them." Charlotte found herself studying Colt's profile as he spoke, noting the way his jaw tightened with suppressed emotion. She was beginning to understand that this school represented more than educational opportunity. It was Colt's attempt to heal wounds from his own past by ensuring other children didn't suffer the same neglect. "And now the railroad is going to destroy it," she said, the words heavy with implications she was only beginning to understand. "Progress has its costs," Colt replied, echoing the kind of phrase Charlotte had heard her father use countless times. But coming from Colt, the words carried no satisfaction, only resignation. As they finished cleaning the slates in companionable silence, Charlotte found herself thinking about the children she'd observed that morning. Tommy Henderson, struggling with arithmetic, but demonstrating unconscious mathematical thinking when it related to cattle. Maria Hernandez, carefully forming letters that represented her growing connection to a wider world. The mute child in the corner, she'd noticed him but hadn't learned his name, who seemed to follow every lesson with intense concentration, despite never speaking. These weren't just abstract beneficiaries of educational philanthropy. They were individuals with their own stories, their own dreams, their own potential. And in a matter of weeks, their chance to develop that potential would disappear beneath tons of steel and timber as the railroad claimed their schoolhouse for its own purposes. For the first time since arriving in Cedar Ridge, Charlotte found herself questioning whether her father's vision of progress was entirely correct. Perhaps some things were worth preserving, even if they stood in the way of railroad expansion. Perhaps the true measure of progress wasn't how quickly you could connect distant places, but how well you nurtured the growth of individual human beings. These were dangerous thoughts for a Van Buren to entertain. But as Charlotte walked back to the boarding house that afternoon, she couldn't shake the image of Colt's patient hands cleaning slates for tomorrow's lessons, preparing for a future he knew would never come. That evening, Charlotte sat at the small wooden table in her boarding house room, a leather-bound journal open before her. The journal had been a gift from her finishing school headmistress, intended for recording observations about art, literature, and social gatherings. Instead, Charlotte found herself sketching the Cedar Ridge schoolhouse from memory, her pencil capturing the modest building's simple lines and the way afternoon light slanted through its windows. She'd always been drawn to sketching, though her tutors had considered it a lesser accomplishment compared to watercolor painting. There was something immediate and honest about pencil on paper that appealed to her, a directness that formal painting techniques seemed to obscure. Now, as she worked to capture the essence of Colt's school, she found herself paying attention to details she'd never consciously noticed. The way the hand-carved sign above the door sat slightly crooked, giving the building a humble, approachable quality. The careful placement of the windows to maximize natural light. The small garden plot beside the building where someone had planted wildflowers that brought color to the dusty landscape. Each detail spoke of care and attention, of someone who'd built not just for function, but for beauty. As Charlotte sketched, she found herself adding the children she'd observed. Maria bent over her slate, Tommy puzzling through arithmetic, the mute boy whose name she still didn't know, but whose intense concentration had stayed with her. The act of drawing forced her to really see these children as individuals rather than abstractions. A soft knock at her door interrupted her work. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Murphy with evening tea. Instead, Colt Ramsey stood in her doorway, hat in hand, an expression of polite uncertainty on his weathered face. "Begging your pardon, Miss Van Buren, Mrs. Murphy said you might be willing to help with something." Charlotte quickly closed her journal, suddenly self-conscious about her sketches. "What kind of help?" "One of my students is in some trouble. Timothy Walshy, he's 8 years old, and his father sent him to work at the Patterson Ranch today. The boy took a bad fall from a horse and hurt his arm. Dr. Peterson says it's not broken, but Timothy's pretty shaken up. His father's working late, and the boy's been asking for someone who knows letters to write a message to his grandmother back in Missouri." Charlotte felt a flutter of uncertainty. "I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. Timothy learned to read this past month, but writing's still hard for him, especially with his arm hurting. I was hoping you might be willing to help him compose a letter. He's staying at the Peterson place tonight, and it would mean a great deal to him." The request was so far outside Charlotte's normal experience that she almost declined automatically. Young ladies of her station didn't make house calls to attend injured ranch children. But something in Colt's expression, a combination of concern for his student and tentative hope that she might help, made her reconsider. "Of course," she heard herself saying. "Let me get my writing materials." The Peterson house was a modest structure on the edge of town, distinguished mainly by the doctor's shingle hanging beside the front door. Dr. Peterson, a gruff but kindly man in his 60s, led Charlotte and Colt to a small back room where Timothy Walsh lay on a narrow bed, his left arm in a sling and his eyes red from recent tears. "Timothy," Colt said gently, settling into a chair beside the bed, "I brought Miss Van Buren to help you with that letter to your grandmother." Timothy's eyes widened as he took in Charlotte's fine clothes and careful appearance. "She looks like a real lady," he whispered to Colt, as if Charlotte couldn't hear him. "I am a real lady," Charlotte said with a smile, pulling up another chair, "and real ladies know how to write letters." What would you like to tell your grandmother? For the next hour, Charlotte found herself serving as scribe for Timothy's rambling. Heartfelt message to the grandmother who'd raised him before his father brought him west. The boy's words painted a picture of loneliness and homesickness that Charlotte found unexpectedly moving. Tell her about school, Timothy said earnestly. Tell her I can read now, and Mr. Ramsey says I'm getting real good at arithmetic. Tell her I miss her cornbread, but Mrs. Murphy makes good biscuits too. As Charlotte wrote, she became aware of Colt watching her with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. When Timothy finally exhausted his list of things to tell his grandmother, Colt helped the boy compose a proper closing, and Charlotte addressed the envelope in her careful penmanship. There, she said, sealing the letter with wax from Dr. Peterson's desk. This will go out on tomorrow's mail coach. Timothy's face lit up with the first real smile she'd seen from him. Thank you, miss. Grandmother's going to be so happy to get a real letter. As they walked back toward the boarding house, Charlotte found herself reflecting on the evening's unexpected turn. Do you often make house calls for your students? She asked Colt, when they need it. Teaching doesn't end when school lets out, especially with children who don't have much support at home. Charlotte thought about her own education, where tutors arrived at appointed times and departed when lessons concluded. The idea of teachers as ongoing figures in children's lives was foreign to her experience, but appealing in its humanity. Timothy seems very attached to this grandmother, she observed. She's the only family member who ever made him feel valued. His father brought him west looking for work, but he's not much of a parent. Timothy's grandmother taught him his prayers and basic manners, told him stories, made him feel like he mattered. That's why learning to read and write is so important to him. It's his way of staying connected to the person who loved him. The simple explanation hit Charlotte with unexpected force. In her world, literacy was assumed, a basic requirement for participation in society. She'd never considered what it might mean to a child to acquire the ability to communicate across vast distances with someone who loved them. I have something that might interest you, Charlotte said impulsively as they reached the boarding house. Steps. Would you like to see my sketches of the school? Colt's eyebrows rose in surprise. You've been sketching the school? Charlotte led him to the small parlor and retrieved her journal, opening it to the pages she'd worked on that evening. Colt studied the drawings with careful attention, his expression thoughtful. These are remarkable, he said finally. You've captured something about the place that I see every day, but never really thought about. What do you mean? Colt pointed to her sketch of the building itself. The way you've drawn it, it looks solid, permanent. Like it belongs here, like it was always meant to be here. Charlotte looked at her own drawing with fresh eyes, seeing what Colt had noticed. She'd unconsciously rendered the schoolhouse as an integral part of the landscape, not an intrusion upon it. Maybe that's because it does belong here, she said quietly. Their eyes met across the journal, and Charlotte felt something shift between them, recognition of shared understanding that transcended their very different backgrounds. For a moment, the distance between railroad heiress and frontier teacher seemed insignificant compared to their common appreciation for what the school represented. Miss Van Buren, Colt said carefully, may I ask you something? Of course. When the railroad takes the school property, will there be any possibility of rebuilding somewhere else? I know your father's company sometimes provides assistance with relocations. Charlotte felt her heart sink as she considered the practical realities. The truth is, Mr. Ramsey, that relocations are expensive and complicated. The company's priority is completing the railroad on schedule and within budget. Additional expenditures for displaced properties. She trailed off, unable to complete. The sentence that would dash his hopes. Colt nodded slowly, his expression accepting but sad. I understand. Business is business. Perhaps there might be other options, Charlotte said impulsively, though she had no idea what those options might be. I could speak with my father when he arrives. He's not unreasonable when it comes to community needs. Even as she spoke the words, Charlotte knew they were more hope than reality. Cornelius Van Buren was many things intelligent, determined, occasionally generous, but he was not a man who let sentiment interfere with business decisions. Still, the look of cautious hope that crossed Colt's face made her glad she'd offered the possibility. However slim dot as Colt took his leave that evening, Charlotte found herself thinking about the letter she'd helped Timothy write. The boy's simple desire to maintain connection with someone who loved him seemed to represent something essential about human nature, the need to be known, valued, and remembered. Looking at her sketches again, Charlotte realized she was documenting something precious that was about to disappear. These drawings might become the only record of what Colt Ramsey had built in Cedar Ridge, the only evidence that 50 children had once gathered here to learn and grow and dream of futures beyond there. Circumstances, the thought, filled her with an unexpected sense of urgency. If she couldn't save the school, perhaps she could at least preserve its memory. But even as she turned to a fresh page in her journal, Charlotte found herself hoping that memory wouldn't be all that remained of Colt's dream. The morning brought unwelcome news in the form of an official-looking document that Mayor Welland delivered to Colt's door before sunrise. Charlotte watched from her boarding house window as the two men stood on the schoolhouse steps, their conversation too distant to hear, but their body language telling a clear story of tension and disappointment. Later that morning, as Charlotte made her customary walk past the school, she found Colt sitting on the front steps with the document spread across his knees. His weathered hands held a deed, the original papers that had granted him ownership of the small plot of land where his school stood. Legal troubles? Charlotte asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Colt looked up, his expression weary. Seems there's some question about my claim to this property. The railroad's lawyers have been doing research, and they found irregularities in the original land grant. Charlotte felt her stomach drop. This was a common tactic used by railroad companies when simple purchase offers proved insufficient. Property law on the frontier was often murky, with competing claims and incomplete documentation creating opportunities for legal challenges. What kind of irregularities? She asked, settling beside him on the steps. The original homesteader who claimed this land never completed the residency requirements before he sold it to me. According to the lawyers, that makes the sale invalid, and the property technically unclaimed federal land. Colt's voice carried the flat tone of a man trying to contain his emotions. Federal land that can be granted to railroad companies for the public good. Charlotte knew the legal framework he was describing. The Railroad Acts had given companies broad powers to acquire land for their routes, including the authority to claim unclaimed federal property. If Colt's deed was invalid, his school sat on land that the government could simply grant to the Van Buren Railroad without compensation. Surely there must be some recourse, she said, though her knowledge of frontier property law was limited. You've been improving the land, built structures on it. That must count for something. Maybe. Mayor Welland says I can contest the ruling, but that would mean hiring lawyers and going to court in the territorial capital. Even if I had the money for such things, which I don't, it could take months or years to resolve. The cruelty of the situation struck Charlotte with full force. Colt had invested everything he had in creating something good, only to discover that his legal foundation was built on sand. Even if he ultimately won a court battle, the school would be long gone by the time the legal system reached a conclusion. I'm sorry, she said, and meant it more deeply than she'd meant most apologies in her life. This isn't right. Colt folded the deed carefully and tucked it into his jacket pocket. Right and legal aren't always the same thing, Miss Van Buren. I learned that lesson young. As if summoned by their conversation about legal troubles, the sound of approaching horses drew their attention to the main road. A group of riders was approaching Cedar Ridge, their pace purposeful, and their formation suggesting official business. Charlotte's heart sank as she recognized the lead rider, her father, Cornelius Van Buren, arriving earlier than expected and with more men than she'd anticipated. Behind him rode the railroad's chief surveyor, a legal representative, and 3 men who looked like the kind of enforcers that companies employed when diplomacy proved insufficient. Cornelius Van Buren was an imposing figure even when he wasn't trying to be. Tall and broad-shouldered despite his 60 years, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who'd built an empire through force of will and strategic thinking. His silver hair was perfectly groomed despite the journey, and his clothes marked him as someone accustomed to wealth and the respect it commanded. Charlotte stood as her father's party approached, suddenly aware of how the scene must look. Railroad heiress sitting companionably with the schoolmaster, whose property her family's company was about to seize. "Charlotte," Cornelius said as he dismounted, his tone carefully neutral, "I wasn't expecting to find you here." "Father," she replied, matching his formal tone. "Your arrival is earlier than planned." Cornelius's gaze moved from Charlotte to Colt, assessing the cowboy with the practiced eye of a man who'd spent decades evaluating potential obstacles to his plans. "You must be Ramsey. I'm Cornelius Van Buren." Colt stood and extended his hand, meeting Cornelius's handshake with quiet dignity. "Mr. Van Buren, I've heard a great deal about your railroad." "All good, I hope," Cornelius said with a kind of smile that was more performance than warmth. "I understand you've built quite an establishment here. Admirable initiative." Charlotte watched the exchange with growing tension, recognizing her father's tone as the one he used when delivering bad news with surface politeness. "Mr. Ramsey," Cornelius continued, "I'm afraid we need to discuss some property matters. My legal team has discovered some complications with your land ownership that will need to resolve before proceeding with our construction." "I've just been informed of those complications," Colt replied evenly. "Seems my deed isn't worth the paper it's written on." "These frontier property issues can be quite complex," Cornelius said with practiced sympathy. "The good news is that we're prepared to offer you fair compensation for your improvements to the property. The school building, your labor, the materials you've invested will make you whole." Charlotte felt something cold settle in her chest as she realized her father was offering to buy Colt's school as if it were just another piece of property to be cleared for railroad construction. "How much?" Colt asked simply. The legal representative consulted a document from his saddlebags. "We're prepared to offer $300 for the structure and improvements." Charlotte saw Colt's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. $300 was probably more cash than he'd ever seen at one time, but she suspected it fell far short of what he'd actually invested in the school. Never mind what it was worth to the community. "And the children?" Colt asked. "Where are they supposed to go to school?" Cornelius spread his hands in a gesture that suggested such concerns were beyond his authority. "That's a matter for the local community to decide. Perhaps arrangements can be made with one of the larger towns along our route. Progress often requires temporary sacrifices, but the long-term benefits to the region will be substantial." Charlotte found herself studying her father as he spoke, noting the smooth confidence with which he dismissed the concerns of 50 children as a minor inconvenience. This was the same man who donated thousands of dollars to build schools in Philadelphia, who'd funded scholarships for promising students, who'd spoken eloquently at dinner parties about the importance of education for American progress. But those had been gestures toward deserving institutions in proper places. This was different, a frontier school for children who didn't matter to anyone with power or influence. "I'll need some time to consider your offer," Colt said finally. "Of course," Cornelius replied, "but I should mention that our construction schedule is quite firm. We'll need to begin clearing this section within the month." After her father's party departed for the mayor's office to handle official paperwork, Charlotte found herself alone with Colt again. The silence between them was heavy with unspoken recognition of how the conversation had changed everything. $300, Colt said finally, his voice carrying a bitter note she'd never heard before. About what most folks around here make in 2 years of hard work. It's not enough, Charlotte said quietly. No, it's not. But it's probably all I'm going to get. Colt looked at the schoolhouse as if seeing it for the last time. Question is, what do I do with the time I have left? Charlotte wanted to say something comforting, to offer hope or solutions, but the legal and financial realities were stark. Her father's company had the law on their side, the money to enforce their will, and a schedule that left no room for sentiment. The children don't know yet, Colt continued. I'll have to tell them soon, but I keep hoping something might change. What if there was another way? Charlotte asked impulsively. What if the school could be moved to a different location? With what money? Even if I could find suitable land, moving the building would cost more than I have. And that's assuming I could find a place where the children could still attend. Charlotte fell silent, recognizing the practical impossibility of what she'd suggested. But as she watched Colt study his school with the expression of a man preparing to lose everything that mattered to him, she found herself thinking about the legal documents in her father's saddlebags and the power they represented. Somewhere in those papers lay the fate of 50 children's educations and one man's dream of making a difference in the world. And somewhere in Charlotte's growing understanding of what was at stake lay the seeds of a decision that would change her life forever. That evening, Charlotte sat in her boarding house room with documents spread across her small table. Mrs. Murphy had provided her with the town's original charter, a yellowed, carefully preserved document that dated back to Cedar Ridge's founding, 15 years earlier. Charlotte had requested to see it under the pretense of researching local history for her railroad report. But her real purpose was more personal. She'd spent her girlhood listening to her father's business conversations, absorbing more about legal matters and property rights than most young ladies of her station. Now, as she carefully studied the charter's archaic language, she found herself looking for loopholes, exceptions, or forgotten clauses that might provide protection for Colt's school. The document was dense with legal terminology, but one section caught her attention. Article 7, subsection 3, contained a provision protecting educational facilities established for the betterment of the community and the cultivation of American citizens. The language was broad and somewhat vague, but it seemed to suggest that educational institutions held special status in the town's governance. A soft knock interrupted her research. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Murphy with evening tea. Instead, her father entered, his expression a mixture of concern and curiosity. "Charlotte, we need to talk." She hastily gathered the charter documents, but Cornelius had already noted them. "Local history research?" he asked, settling into the room's single chair. "Something like that." Charlotte folded her hands in her lap, adopting the posture of dutiful daughter that had served her well through years of navigating her father's moods. "I'm concerned about what I observed today," Cornelius said without preamble. "You seemed quite familiar with this schoolmaster, perhaps more involved in local affairs than would be appropriate for someone representing her company's interests." Charlotte felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. "I've been conducting thorough research into the community impact of our proposed route. That includes understanding local institutions, Charlotte." Her father's tone carried the weight of years of business negotiations. "I know you better than that. What I saw today wasn't research. You were personally invested in that man's situation." The directness of his observation left Charlotte momentarily speechless. Her father had always been perceptive about human motivations. It was one of the qualities that made him successful in business. But she hadn't realized her growing attachment to Colt, and his school had been so obvious. The school serves 50 children, she said finally. Surely that's worth some consideration in our planning. And we've made fair compensation for the necessary property acquisition. $300 is generous for a building of that type in this location. It's not about the money, Father. It's about what those children will lose. Cornelius studied his daughter with the same analytical gaze he'd used on Colt earlier. Charlotte, I've built this railroad empire by making difficult decisions for the greater good. Yes, individual situations sometimes involve hardship, but the benefits to the broader community, jobs, commerce, connection to the wider world far outweigh the temporary inconveniences. Temporary inconveniences? Charlotte couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Father, these children have no other educational options. Without this school, they'll grow up illiterate. That's unfortunate, but it's not our responsibility. We're a railroad company, not a charitable foundation. The cold practicality of his response sparked something in Charlotte that had been building for days. What about Mother? Cornelius's expression grew still. What about her? Mother always said that progress without compassion was just destruction in disguise. She believed in using our advantages to help others, not just to accumulate more advantages. Your mother, Cornelius said carefully, lived in a different time with different challenges. She had the luxury of sentiment because I handled the practical necessities. Charlotte felt pieces of understanding click into place as she processed her father's words. She wanted to do more charitable work, didn't she? And you discouraged it. I protected her from the harsh realities of business so she could maintain her ideals. Or you prevented her from acting on those ideals because they interfered with your business interests. The silence that followed Charlotte's words was charged with 15 years of unspoken tensions. She'd never directly challenged her father's decisions before, never questioned his wisdom or his methods. But sitting in this modest room in a frontier town, surrounded by evidence of one man's attempt to make a difference despite overwhelming obstacles, she found she couldn't maintain her usual diplomatic silence. Charlotte, Cornelius said finally, his voice heavy with paternal authority, you're allowing emotion to cloud your judgment. I understand that frontier life can seem romantic, that simple people and simple problems can appear appealing after the complexities of our world. But sentiment is a luxury we can't afford in business. This isn't about sentiment. It's about doing what's right. What's right is completing this railroad on schedule and within budget, providing jobs and opportunities for thousands of people, and connecting isolated communities to the economic mainstream. The needs of the many outweigh the preferences of the few. Charlotte recognized the logic. It was the same reasoning that had driven every major decision in the Van Buren Empire. But for the first time, she found herself questioning whether that logic was complete. What if there was a way to do both? She asked, what if we could build the railroad and preserve the school? Cornelius shook his head. Charlotte, I've reviewed the engineering reports. The route through this section is dictated by grade requirements and water access. There's no practical alternative that wouldn't add significant cost and delay. What about moving the school? With whose money? The company has no obligation to relocate private structures, especially when the original ownership is legally questionable. Charlotte felt frustration building as each potential solution ran up against the wall of financial and legal reality. But even as her father systematically dismantled her arguments, she found herself thinking about Colt's patient hands cleaning slates for tomorrow's lessons, about Timothy Walsh's letter to his grandmother, about Maria Hernandez's growing confidence with her letters. I want to make a formal request, she said finally. Cornelius raised an eyebrow. What kind of request? I want the company to fund relocation of the school to a suitable alternative site. On what grounds? Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line that would change her relationship with her father forever. On the grounds that it's the right thing to do. On the grounds that Mother would have wanted it. on the grounds that we have the power to help these children, and choosing not to help them makes us complicit in destroying their futures. The words hung in the air between them, and Charlotte saw something shift in her father's expression. Surprise, perhaps, or recognition that his daughter had inherited more of her mother's moral conviction than he'd realized. "Charlotte," he said gently, "the world is full of worthy causes and deserving people. If we stopped to help everyone we encountered, we'd never accomplish anything of lasting significance. But we don't encounter them all personally. We encountered this one. Doesn't that create some obligation?" Cornelius stood and moved to the small window, looking out at the town his railroad would transform. "Your mother used to make similar arguments," he said quietly. "She had a generous heart, perhaps too generous for the practical demands of our position." Charlotte sensed an opening in her father's defenses. "What happened to her teaching aspirations?" "I found some old letters in the house that mentioned her interest in education." Cornelius was quiet for a long moment. "Your mother taught briefly before we married. In a frontier school, much like this one, actually. She loved it, but after our marriage, social expectations made it inappropriate for her to continue. She gave up something she loved. She gained something greater, a position in society that allowed her to influence charitable causes on a larger scale." "Did she? Or did she just attend charity galas and write polite letters to worthy organizations?" The question seemed to hit her father like a physical blow. Charlotte realized she'd touched on something he'd perhaps never fully acknowledged, that, in protecting his wife from the practical demands of charity work, he'd also prevented her from doing the hands-on service that had given her life meaning. "The school will be demolished," Cornelius said finally, his voice carrying a note of finality. "The railroad will proceed as planned. That decision is not open for discussion. And if I refuse to support it, then you'll discover that your trust, fund, and your inheritance are contingent on your continued cooperation with family business interests." The threat was delivered calmly, almost conversationally, but Charlotte felt its impact like a cold wind. Her father was making it clear that her comfortable future depended on her willingness to accept the destruction of something she'd come to care deeply about. As Cornelius left her room, Charlotte found herself staring at the town charter spread across her table. The document's promises of protection for educational facilities seemed hollow in the face of her father's determination, but she couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in its archaic language lay the key to saving Colt's school. Outside her window, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled in the darkness, and Charlotte found herself thinking about the children who would wake tomorrow to another day of learning, unaware that their opportunity was slipping away like sand through an hourglass. The following morning brought an unexpected discovery that would change everything. Charlotte thought she knew about her family and herself. While sorting through her father's documents to prepare for the day's railroad business, she found a small wooden box tucked behind his legal papers. The box was old and worn, with a delicate brass latch that spoke of careful craftsmanship from an earlier era. Curiosity overcoming propriety, Charlotte opened the box to find a collection of items that clearly didn't belong to her father. A woman's gold locket, several letters tied with faded ribbon, and most surprisingly, an old daguerreotype photograph that made her heart stop. The photograph showed a young woman standing in front of a rustic schoolhouse, surrounded by a group of frontier children. The woman wore a simple dress and had her hair pulled back in a practical style, but her face was unmistakably familiar. It was Charlotte's mother, Evelyn Van Buren, but not as Charlotte had ever seen her. This wasn't the elegant society matron who'd raised Charlotte, the woman who'd worn silk gowns to charity galas and spoken in measured tones about appropriate causes for ladies of their station. This was a younger Evelyn, her face bright with joy and purpose as she stood among children who looked remarkably similar to Colt's students. With trembling hands, Charlotte untied the ribbon around the letters and began to read. The first letter was addressed to "My dearest Thomas," and dated nearly 30 years earlier. The children made such progress this week. Little Mary finally managed to read an entire page without help, and James has mastered his multiplication tables. I know you think I'm foolish to care so much about these frontier children, but Thomas, if you could see their faces when they discover they can read. There's no feeling in the world quite like it. I'm convinced that education is the greatest gift we can give to the next generation, regardless of their circumstances. Charlotte's hands shook as she realized these were letters from her mother to her father during their courtship, when Evelyn had apparently been teaching at a frontier school. But more shocking was the signature at the bottom, "Your devoted Evelyn, Hartford." Hartford, not Van Buren. These letters predated her parents' marriage, which meant her mother had been a teacher when she met Charlotte's father. Not just someone with vague charitable interests, but an actual educator working with children who had nowhere else to turn. The second letter was even more revealing. "Thomas, I understand your concerns about my teaching position, but I cannot simply abandon these children because our engagement makes it socially awkward. They depend on me, and I've made commitments to their families. Surely we can find a way for me to continue this work even after we marry? I know other women have managed to balance marriage with meaningful pursuits." Charlotte felt pieces of her family history rearranging themselves as she read. Her father had told her that her mother had briefly taught before their marriage, but he'd made it sound like a temporary diversion rather than a passionate calling. These letters revealed a young woman deeply committed to education, struggling to find a way to continue the work she loved despite social pressures. The third letter was shorter and carried a note of resignation that broke Charlotte's heart. "Thomas, I accept your position that my teaching must end when we marry. I understand the social expectations we face, and I don't wish to embarrass you or compromise your business relationships. But I want you to know that giving up my work with these children feels like cutting away a part of my soul. I pray that someday I'll find another way to serve education, perhaps through charitable work with established institutions." Charlotte sank into her chair as the full implications became clear. Her mother hadn't chosen to give up teaching for a better life. She'd been forced to abandon work she loved in order to marry into respectable society. And her father, knowingly or not, had been the architect of that sacrifice. The final item. In the box was another photograph, this one clearly taken years later. It showed Evelyn Van Buren at what appeared to be a charity event, surrounded by well-dressed women in an elegant parlor. But where the first photograph had shown joy and purpose, this image captured something else entirely. Evelyn's smile was polite but distant, her eyes holding a sadness that Charlotte had never noticed in life, but now recognized with painful clarity. Knock at the door interrupted Charlotte's discovery. "Come in," she called, hastily placing the photographs face down on the table. Colt entered, his expression grim. "Miss Van Buren, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." "What is it?" "I've decided to accept your father's offer. $300 for the school." Charlotte felt her heart sink. "Colt, no. There has to be another way. I've thought about it all night, and there's no point in fighting a battle I can't win. At least this way, I'll have enough money to help some of the children's families relocate to places where there are established schools. But what about your dream? What about everything you've built here?" Colt's expression was heavy with resignation. "Dreams are luxuries, Miss Van Buren. These children need practical help, not my stubborn pride." Charlotte looked at the photographs of her mother spread across the table, seeing for the first time the parallel between Evelyn's forced sacrifice and what Colt was now facing. Her mother had given up her calling to conform to social expectations. Colt was giving up his to bow to financial reality. Both sacrifices were born of the same system that valued profit and propriety over purpose and passion. "Colt," she said slowly, "what if I told you there might be another option?" "What kind of option?" Charlotte picked up the daguerreotype of her mother teaching and held it out to him. What if I told you that my mother was once exactly where you are now, that she fought the same battle you're fighting, and that her story might hold the key to saving your school? Colt studied the photograph with growing amazement. That's your mother? Teaching at a frontier school before she married my father. She gave up everything she loved to become a society wife, and I don't think she ever fully recovered from that loss. Charlotte felt pieces of a plan beginning to form in her mind as she spoke. My father destroyed my mother's teaching career because he believed it was necessary for their social position. Now he's about to destroy your school for what he believes are necessary business reasons. But what if the same legal and social structures that forced those sacrifices could be turned around to prevent this one? I don't understand. Charlotte spread the town charter on the table beside her mother's photographs. This document guarantees protection for educational facilities. My mother's letters show that she understood the legal framework surrounding frontier education better than most people of her time. And I have access to resources and influence that you don't. Miss Van Buren Charlotte, what are you suggesting? Charlotte took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to propose would change everything about her relationship with her father and her own future. I'm suggesting that we fight this, not just with legal arguments or financial negotiations, but with the full weight of my family's influence turned toward protecting something good instead of destroying it. That would mean going against your father directly. Yes, it would. Charlotte looked again at the photograph of her mother, seeing in that young teacher's face the passion and purpose that had been gradually crushed by years of social constraint. My mother never got the chance to fight for what she believed in. She was forced to choose between love and calling, and that choice haunted her for the rest of her life. I won't make the same mistake. Colt was quiet for a long moment, studying Charlotte's face as if trying to assess her resolve. You realize what you'd be risking? Your inheritance, your family relationships, your entire future? I realize what I'd be risking if I don't act, Charlotte replied. I'd be risking becoming exactly what my mother became, someone who had the power to make a difference, but chose comfort and safety instead. As Charlotte spoke, she felt something fundamental shifting inside her, as if the discovery of her mother's true story had unlocked parts of herself she'd never known existed. For the first time in her life, she understood what it meant to have a cause worth fighting for, regardless of the personal cost. The red stakes marking the railroad's route still stood outside. Charlotte's transformation from dutiful daughter to determined advocate began immediately. Armed with her mother's letters and a newfound understanding of both her family's history and her own convictions, she set out to build a case that would save Colt's school. But she knew that emotional appeals alone wouldn't be enough to overcome her father's business logic. She needed legal ammunition. The first step was a careful study of the town charter, which Charlotte approached with the same methodical attention her father had taught her to apply to business documents. Article 7, subsection 3, was indeed promising, but she needed to understand how it had been interpreted in similar cases. That meant research, and research meant a trip to the territorial capital where legal precedents might be found. I need to travel to Alston, she announced to her father over breakfast at Mrs. Murphy's boarding house. There are some legal questions about property rights that require consultation with territorial authorities. Cornelius looked up from his eggs with the sharp attention of a man who'd learned to read between the lines of his daughters carefully. Chosen words. What kind of legal questions? Questions about the validity of land grants in this region, particularly as they relate to educational institutions. Charlotte kept her voice level and professional, the tone she'd learned to use when discussing serious business matters. I want to ensure that our property acquisitions are beyond legal challenge. It wasn't entirely a lie. Charlotte did want to research the legal framework surrounding the school's protection, but her primary goal was to build a case for preserving the institution rather than simply acquiring its property. That seems unnecessarily thorough, Cornelius said slowly. Our legal team has already reviewed the relevant documents. Father, you've always taught me that successful business depends on anticipating challenges before they arise. If there's any possibility of legal complications, isn't it better to address them proactively? Cornelius studied his daughter's face, clearly sensing that something had changed in her approach, but unable to identify exactly what. Very well. Take Henderson with you for protection, and plan to return within the week. As Charlotte prepared for her journey, she found herself thinking about her mother's letters and the passion they'd revealed. Evelyn Van Buren had fought for her students' futures until social pressure and familial obligation had forced her to surrender. Charlotte was determined not to repeat that surrender, but she also understood that she needed to be smarter about her approach than her mother had been. The trip to Austin took 2 days by stagecoach, and Charlotte used the travel time to study every document she'd brought with her. The town charter, her mother's letters, legal precedents she'd copied from her father's business files. All of it needed to be woven into a coherent argument that could withstand scrutiny from experienced lawyers. In Austin, Charlotte discovered that territorial law was indeed more sympathetic to educational institutions than she'd dared hope. A precedent case from 1871 had established that communities had the right to protect established schools even when they conflicted with commercial development, provided certain conditions were met. The school had to serve a genuine community need, demonstrate educational effectiveness, and have the support of local government. Colt's school easily met the first 2 criteria, but the third was more complicated. Mayor Wellen had been lukewarm about the institution from the beginning, viewing it as a distraction from efforts to attract business development. However, Charlotte's research revealed that the mayor's opinion was only one factor the town council as a whole would need to vote on any protection measure. Armed with legal precedents and a growing understanding of territorial education law, Charlotte returned to Cedar Ridge with a plan that was audacious in its scope and uncertain in its chances of success. She would force a town council vote on protecting the school under the educational provision of the charter, using her family's influence and her mother's story to build public support for the measure. But first, she needed to prepare Colt for what was coming. You want to do what? Colt asked when Charlotte explained her plan. They were sitting in the schoolhouse after the day's lessons, surrounded by the evidence of his students' progress, arithmetic problems worked out on slates, essays written in careful penmanship, maps drawn to help children understand the larger world beyond Cedar Ridge. I want to force a public vote on protecting the school, Charlotte repeated. The territorial precedents are clear. Communities have the right to preserve educational institutions that serve the public good. And you think the town council will vote to protect my school over your father's railroad? Charlotte hesitated before answering, recognizing the magnitude of what she was asking him to risk. I think they might, if we can make them understand what's at stake. But Colt, I need you to know that this isn't guaranteed. If we lose the vote, your situation might actually be worse than it is now. How could it be worse? My father doesn't like to be challenged publicly. If we force a confrontation and lose, he might withdraw the compensation offer entirely. Colt was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of children in a group photograph that hung on the schoolhouse wall. What changed your mind? Yesterday, you seemed resigned to accepting the inevitable. Charlotte pulled out the daguerreotype of her mother teaching and placed it on the desk between them. I found out that my mother fought this same battle 30 years ago. She lost, and I don't think she ever forgave herself or my father for giving up her calling. And you don't want to make the same mistake. I don't want to live with the knowledge that I had the power to save something good and chose not to use it. Colt picked up the photograph, studying Evelyn Van Buren's young face with the same careful attention he gave to his students' work. She looks happy here. Really happy. She was. And she never looked that happy again. Not in all the years I knew her. What will happen to you if we do this? If we challenge your father publicly? Charlotte had been dreading this question because she knew the answer would reveal just how much she was risking. I'll probably lose my inheritance. Possibly my family. Entirely. My father doesn't tolerate disloyalty, especially when it's public. Charlotte, you can't throw away your entire future for my school. I'm not throwing it away. I'm choosing a different future. Charlotte stood and walked to the window, looking out at the children playing in the schoolyard. These past weeks in Cedar Ridge have shown me something I never knew I was missing. I've watched you teach, seen how you connect with each child. As an individual, witness the joy on their faces when they master something new. That's real accomplishment, Colt. That's work that matters. It's also work that pays poorly and offers no security. Charlotte turned back to face him, and Colt saw in her expression the same determined light he'd seen in his best students when they finally grasped a difficult concept. I have money of my own, separate from my father's estate. Not a fortune, but enough to live modestly and contribute to causes I believe in. If I lose my inheritance, I won't starve. And if you lose your family? Then I'll build a new family with people who share my values rather than just my bloodline. The weight of what Charlotte was offering settled between them like a heavy presence. She wasn't just proposing to help save his school. She was proposing to abandon her entire previous life in favor of a future built around education, community, service, and the kind of hands-on work that her mother had been forced to give up. There's something else, Charlotte said quietly. Something I haven't told you yet. What is it? I've been corresponding with educators back east, people who are interested in frontier education projects. If we can save the school, I think I can arrange for additional funding and resources. Books, supplies, maybe even a second teacher. Colt stared at her in amazement. You've been planning this for a while. I've been hoping for it. Planning was probably too optimistic a word until I found those legal precedents. Charlotte, are you sure about this? Really sure? Because once we challenge your father publicly, there's no going back. Charlotte looked once more at the photograph of her mother, then at the children's artwork covering the schoolhouse walls, then finally at Colt himself, this man who'd risked everything to give children a chance at better futures. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. That evening, Charlotte began the delicate work of building support for the town council vote. She started with Mrs. Murphy, who'd seen firsthand how the school had changed the prospects of several local children. Then Dr. Peterson, who'd witnessed the improved health and optimism of families whose children were learning to read. One by one, she visited parents and community leaders, sharing her legal research and her vision for what the school could become with proper support. The response was cautiously positive, but tinged with realism about the power dynamics involved. Everyone understood that challenging the Van Buren Railroad was a risky proposition for a frontier community that desperately needed economic development. But Charlotte had one more card to play, a card that she hoped would prove decisive when the time came to vote. The town council meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the makeshift municipal building that served as Cedar Ridge's seat of government. Word had spread throughout the community that Charlotte Van Buren would be making a formal presentation about the school's future, and by 6 o'clock, every seat in the small hall was occupied with standing room only along the walls. Charlotte sat in the front row, a leather portfolio containing her legal research balanced on her knees. Beside her, Colt wore his best shirt and jacket, his weathered hands clasped tightly in his lap. They had spent the previous evening preparing their presentation, but Charlotte knew that success would depend on more than legal arguments. It would require touching the hearts of people who had their own families and futures to consider. Mayor Wellen called the meeting to order with visible reluctance. Charlotte suspected he would have preferred to handle the school issue quietly, without the public scrutiny that her request for a formal hearing had created. But territorial law required public discussion of matters affecting community institutions, and Charlotte had made sure to invoke every legal protection available. We're here tonight to consider a petition regarding the Cedar Ridge School. Wellen announced. Miss Charlotte Van Buren has requested a hearing on the matter of protecting the school under Article 7 of our town charter. Charlotte stood, feeling the weight of 50 pairs of eyes upon her. She had spoken at charity events and social gatherings before, but never with so much at stake. These weren't polite society matrons making token donations to worthy causes. These were hard-working people whose decisions would determine the futures of their own children. Members of the council, fellow residents of Cedar Ridge, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the small hall. I come before you tonight, not as the daughter of a railroad magnate, but as someone who has witnessed firsthand the remarkable work being done at our community school. She gestured toward a collection of items displayed on a table at the front of the room. Student essays, arithmetic problems worked out in careful handwriting, maps drawn by children learning geography, and most prominently, a stack of letters written by students to family members in distant places. These are testimonial letters, Charlotte continued, written by students to express what the school has meant to them. With your permission, I'd like to share some of their words. Mayor Wellen nodded reluctantly, and Charlotte picked up the first letter, written in the careful script of 10-year-old Maria Hernandez. Dear Council, she read, before I came to Mr. Ramsey's school, I thought I was too stupid to learn anything. My papa died and my mama got sick, and I figured I would just work until I died too. But Mr. Ramsey taught me that words have power, and numbers make sense, and I can read stories about places I never knew existed. Now I want to become a teacher myself someday, so I can help other children like me. Please don't take away our school. It's the only hope some of us have. A murmur ran through the audience as Charlotte set down Maria's letter and picked up another, this one from 15-year-old James Patterson, the store owner's nephew. I used to think school was just for rich kids, she read, but Mr. Ramsey showed me that learning is for anyone willing to work hard. I can read newspapers now and figure complex arithmetic, and I'm helping my uncle with his business ledgers. The school didn't just teach me facts, it taught me that I'm capable of more than I thought. If you close the school, you're telling every child in this town that they don't deserve a chance to grow. One by one, Charlotte read excerpts from student letters, each one revealing a young person whose life had been transformed by access to education. The hall grew increasingly quiet as parents recognized their own children's voices in the testimonials, many hearing for the first time just how profoundly the school had affected their families. When Charlotte finished reading the letters, she set them aside and faced the council directly. These testimonials represent more than individual success stories. They represent the kind of community Cedar Ridge can become if we choose to invest in our children's futures, rather than sacrificing them to outside interests. Councilman Morrison, a rancher who employed several of the older students during busy seasons, raised his hand. Miss Van Buren, we all appreciate what Mr. Ramsey has accomplished, but let's be practical. Your father's railroad will bring jobs and commerce to this region. Surely the long-term economic benefits outweigh the temporary disruption to one small school. Charlotte had anticipated this argument and was prepared with her response. Mr. Morrison, you're absolutely right that economic development is important. But I'd like to suggest that education and economic progress aren't opposing forces. They're complementary ones. She moved to a map of Texas that Colt had hung on the wall for geography lessons. Every successful community along existing railroad lines has discovered that economic growth depends on having an educated workforce. Businesses want to locate where they can find employees who can read, write, and handle basic mathematics. Towns with good schools attract better businesses and more prosperous settlers. But the railroad brings immediate jobs, countered Mrs. Caldwell, whose husband worked in railroad construction. It does, Charlotte agreed, and those jobs are valuable. But they're also temporary. Once the tracks are laid, most of the construction workers move on to the next project. What remains is a railroad depot and a few permanent positions. The real question is, what kind of community will be left behind? Charlotte walked back to the student displays, picking up a carefully drawn map that showed railroad connections throughout the state. This was created by 12-year-old Robert Walsh, who's been studying transportation and commerce. Robert understands that railroads connect communities, but he also understands that successful communities need educated residents to take advantage of those connections. She faced the council again, her voice growing stronger with conviction. I'm not asking you to choose between the railroad and the school. I'm asking you to recognize that preserving our educational institution is the best way to ensure that Cedar Ridge benefits from railroad development rather than simply being used by it. Mayor Wellen shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Miss Van Buren, your arguments are persuasive, but you're asking us to oppose a powerful railroad company. What guarantees do we have that protecting the school won't result in the railroad bypassing Cedar Ridge entirely? This was the crucial moment, and Charlotte felt her heart racing as she prepared to reveal the final element of her strategy. Mayor Wellen, I can't guarantee what my father's company will do if you vote to protect the school, but I can tell you what I'm prepared to do regardless of that vote. She opened her portfolio and removed a legal document that she'd spent considerable time and money having prepared in Austin. This is a formal deed of gift, transferring ownership of the significant parcel of land on the eastern edge of town from my personal holdings to the Cedar Ridge School District. Gasps echoed through the hall as people realized what Charlotte was announcing. She owned land in Cedar Ridge land that she was offering to give away for educational purposes. The parcel is large enough for a school building, teacher housing, and room for future expansion. It has good water access and lies along the proposed railroad, but in a location where both the railroad and the school can coexist. Charlotte looked directly at her father, who had been sitting silently in the back of the hall with his arms crossed and his expression unreadable. Whether the council votes to protect the current school or not, this gift ensures that Cedar Ridge will have a permanent educational institution. The only question is whether we'll have one school or two. The room erupted in surprised conversation as people processed the implications of Charlotte's announcement. She was essentially forcing the issue by creating a competing educational facility that couldn't be easily dismissed or destroyed. But Charlotte wasn't finished. She raised her hand for silence and continued, furthermore, I'm prepared to fund the school's operations for the first 5 years, including teacher salaries, books, and supplies. I've already established correspondence with educational authorities in Austin and Philadelphia who are interested in supporting frontier education initiatives. Mayor Wellen looked stunned. Miss Van Buren, are you saying you're willing to fund an entire school system for our community? I'm saying that education is too important to be subject to the financial whims of outside interests. Cedar Ridge's children deserve a stable, well-supported educational opportunity, and I'm prepared to help provide that regardless of what happens with the railroad. As Charlotte sat down, she felt the weight of what she just committed to, not just financially, but personally. She had publicly opposed her father's business interests and committed her own resources to a cause that would define the rest of her life. There was no going back now. The silence that followed Charlotte's announcement stretched for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Cornelius Van Buren stood slowly from his seat in the back of the hall, his presence commanding immediate attention from everyone present. If I may address the council, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being heard, and heated. Mayor Wellen nodded nervously. Of course, Mr. Van Buren. Cornelius walked deliberately to the front of the room, his eyes never leaving Charlotte's face. When he reached the speaking area, he turned to address the council and assembled townspeople with the same commanding presence he'd used to build a railroad empire. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, my daughter has made some remarkable promises. Tonight, promises that I suspect she may not have fully considered in terms of their practical implications. Charlotte felt her heart hammering as her father continued, "Building and operating a school requires more than good intentions and initial funding. It requires ongoing commitment, administrative expertise, and the kind of long-term stability that comes from institutional support rather than individual philanthropy." Several council members nodded, clearly swayed by this practical assessment. Charlotte realized her father was systematically undermining her proposal by highlighting its dependence on her personal resources and commitment. Furthermore, Cornelius continued, the Van Buren Railroad represents an opportunity for economic development that could benefit this entire region for generations. The temporary inconvenience of relocating one small school seems a modest price to pay for connecting Cedar Ridge to the broader commercial network that will determine its future prosperity. Charlotte watched faces in the audience as her father spoke, seeing doubt creep into expressions that had seemed supportive just moments before. He was reminding them that opposing the railroad might cost them far more than just the school. It might cost them their entire economic future. But then something unexpected happened. Colt Ramsey stood up. "Mr. Van Buren," he said quietly, "may I respond to your concerns?" Cornelius looked surprised at being challenged by the schoolmaster, but nodded curtly. "Of course." Colt moved to the front of the room with the same calm dignity Charlotte had observed in his teaching. "You're right that running a school requires ongoing commitment. I've been providing that commitment for the past 18 months, often with my own resources and always with the support of this community." He gestured toward the parents and families filling the hall. "Every person in this room has contributed something to the school's success, labor, materials, encouragement, or simply the trust to send their children to learn. This isn't one person's project anymore. It's a community institution." Charlotte felt a surge of admiration for Colt's quiet strength as he continued. "As for administrative expertise, I may not have formal training in education administration, but I've learned what these children need by working with them every day. I know which teaching methods reach Tommy Henderson and which ones work better for Maria Hernandez. I know how to help a mute child find his voice and how to encourage a girl to believe she's worth educating." Colt picked up one of the student letters from Charlotte's display. "You speak about economic development, Mr. Van Buren, and I don't disagree with its importance. But economic development without educated citizens leads to boom and bust, cycles that leave communities worse off than they started. Educated citizens create sustainable prosperity." "That's a fine theory," Cornelius replied, "but theories don't pay for railroad construction or guarantee continued funding for small schools." "You're right," Colt agreed, "but commitments do." He turned to face the assembled townspeople directly. "I want to make my own commitment tonight, in front of everyone who supported this school. I commit to teaching here for as long as this community wants me, regardless of what happens with the railroad. Whether we keep the current building, move to Miss Van Buren's property, or hold classes under that old oak tree, I'll continue teaching these children." A murmur of approval ran through the crowd, and Charlotte saw several parents nodding with evident emotion. "Furthermore," Colt continued, "I propose that we formalize this school as a proper district institution with community oversight rather than depending on any individual's philanthropy. We can establish a school board, set up sustainable funding through local taxes and territorial support, and ensure that education in Cedar Ridge doesn't depend on the generosity of outsiders." Charlotte realized that Colt was brilliantly addressing her father's criticism while simultaneously offering a solution that would make the school truly independent. By proposing community ownership and control, he was removing both her father's power to destroy it and her own role as indispensable benefactor. Mayor Wellen looked uncertain. "Mr. Ramsey, establishing a formal school district requires territorial approval and ongoing tax revenue. Are you confident this community can support such an undertaking?" Before Colt could answer, Dr. Peterson stood up. "I'd like to speak to that question." The doctor moved forward with the authority of someone whose opinion carried weight in the community. "Mayor, I've been practicing medicine in this region for 20 years. I've seen what happens to communities that invest in education and what happens to those that don't." He gestured toward the student displays. "These children aren't just learning to read and write. They're learning to think, to question, to solve problems. That kind of human development is worth more than any single business investment. Moreover," Dr. Peterson continued, "I've done the mathematics on Mr. Ramsey's proposal. Establishing a school district would cost each family approximately $3 per year in additional taxes. $3. Most families here spend more than that on coffee in a month." Mrs. Murphy stood next. "I'll support the school district. These children are our future, and $3 is a small price to pay for giving them proper opportunities." One by one, other community members stood to voice their support. Jim Patterson from the general store, the widow Rodriguez, whose son had learned to read at Colt School, even several of the ranch hands who rarely participated in town meetings, rose to express their backing for the educational initiative. Charlotte watched this outpouring of community support with growing amazement. What had started as her personal crusade was becoming a genuine grassroots movement, with Cedar Ridge's residents claiming ownership of their children's educational future. Finally, Councilman Morrison called for order. "We need to vote on the specific proposal before us. Miss Van Buren has requested protection for the current school under our charter, and Mr. Ramsey has proposed establishing a formal school district. These are related but separate issues." Mayor Wellen nodded. "We'll vote on each proposal separately. First, the motion to protect the current school building under Article 7 of the Town Charter." As the council members prepared to cast their votes, Charlotte felt the weight of everything that had led to this moment: her mother's abandoned dreams, her own growing understanding of what mattered in life, and the trust that Colt and the children had placed in her willingness to fight for their future. The first vote was close, 3 in favor, 2 opposed, but it was enough. The Cedar Ridge School would be protected under territorial education law. The second vote, on establishing a formal school district, was unanimous. Charlotte felt tears of relief and joy as she realized they had won more than she dared hope. Not only was the school saved, but it would have a sustainable future, independent of both railroad interference and her own financial support. 6 months later, Charlotte stood in the doorway of the expanded Cedar Ridge School, watching Colt lead a geography lesson for 43 students, 7 fewer than the original 50. As some families had moved away seeking railroad jobs, but with new children arriving as word spread about the quality education available in their small town, the schoolhouse itself had grown. Using Charlotte's land donation and the community's labor, they'd added a second room and a small library that housed books, donated by educational societies back east. The original hand-carved sign still hung above the door, but now it read, "Cedar Ridge Community School," reflecting the institution's evolution from one man's dream to a shared community achievement. Charlotte had become the school's first official administrator, a role that utilized her organizational skills and connections, while allowing her to work directly with children and families. It wasn't the life she'd been raised to expect, but it was the life she'd chosen, and every day brought fresh confirmation that she'd chosen correctly. Her relationship with her father had required months of careful rebuilding. Cornelius had been furious about her public opposition to the railroad's plans, but he'd also been forced to acknowledge the practical success of the compromise they'd eventually reached. The Van Buren Railroad had adjusted its route slightly to accommodate the school's protection, adding perhaps a month to the construction schedule, but avoiding the negative publicity that would have come from destroying a community's educational institution. More importantly, Charlotte's actions had reminded Cornelius of his late wife's values in ways that had clearly affected him. He'd begun making inquiries about supporting other educational initiatives along the railroad's route, as if trying to honor Evelyn's memory through the kind of charitable work she'd always advocated. "The letter came today," Colt said, approaching Charlotte with an envelope bearing an official seal. "From the Territorial Education Authority." Charlotte opened the letter with fingers that trembled slightly with anticipation. They'd applied for formal recognition as a model frontier school, which would bring additional funding and resources. "We've been approved," she said, reading quickly through the official language. "Not just approved, they want to use Cedar Ridge as a template for establishing schools in other frontier communities." Colt's face lit up with the same joy Charlotte had seen on students' faces when they mastered difficult lessons. "That means other children will have the same opportunities. Our students have had more than that," Charlotte replied, studying the letter's details. "They're offering to fund teacher training programs and provide standardized curricula. Cedar Ridge won't just be a school, it'll be a center for frontier education." As they discussed the implications of the territorial recognition, Charlotte reflected on how much had changed since that day when she'd first observed Colt teaching his arithmetic lesson. She'd arrived in Cedar Ridge as a dutiful daughter, carrying out her father's business, expecting to spend a few weeks in an unremarkable frontier town before returning to her comfortable but unfulfilling life in Philadelphia. Instead, she'd discovered her calling, found her voice, and built a life centered around service rather than social obligations. The work was challenging and sometimes exhausting, but it brought satisfactions that no charity gala or society function had ever provided. The sound of children's laughter drew her attention to the schoolyard, where Maria Hernandez was helping younger students with their reading. Maria had become one of Charlotte's most promising pupils, expressing serious interest in becoming a teacher herself. Under the new territorial program, she'd be able to receive advanced training and potentially return to Cedar Ridge as Colt's teaching partner. "Charlotte," Colt said quietly, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." She turned to find him holding something small in his weathered hands, two simple gold rings that caught the afternoon light streaming through the schoolhouse windows. "I know this isn't the life you were raised for," he continued, his voice carrying the same gentle certainty she'd heard him use with struggling students. "I know you gave up a great deal to be here, but if you're willing to make this commitment permanent, I'd be honored to share this work and this life with you." Charlotte looked at the rings, then at Colt's face, then out at the children playing in the yard of the school they'd fought to save. Everything about this moment was different from the marriage proposals she'd received in Philadelphia. No formal courtship rituals, no discussion of financial arrangements or social advantages. Just two people who'd found common purpose asking each other to make that purpose the foundation of a shared life. "Yes," she said simply, taking one of the rings and slipping it onto her finger. "Yes, I'll marry you." As Colt placed the second ring on his own hand, Charlotte thought about her mother's photograph and the dreams Evelyn Van Buren had been forced to abandon. Charlotte had been able to rescue those dreams and build upon them, creating something that honored her mother's memory while serving the next generation of frontier children. The railroad had been completed on schedule, bringing economic opportunities to Cedar Ridge, just as her father had promised. But the town had also preserved its commitment to education, ensuring that children would be prepared to take advantage of those opportunities rather than simply being used by them, standing in the doorway of their thriving school, her hand in Colt's and their students' voices rising in eager recitation. Charlotte felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you found your place in the world. She'd traded a life of comfort and social prominence for one of service and genuine accomplishment, and she'd never been happier. The evening sun cast long shadows across the plains, painting the landscape in the same golden hues that had first captured Charlotte's attention months earlier. But now she saw the beauty not as a visitor passing through, but as someone who belonged here, who'd found her home in this small town where one man's vision of education had grown into a community's commitment to its children's futures. In years to come, the Cedar Ridge Community School would send its graduates to universities, businesses, and leadership positions throughout Texas and beyond. They would carry with them not just academic knowledge, but the understanding that education was a gift worth preserving and passing on to others. And in the school's small museum, visitors would find a hand-carved wooden sign, a collection of student letters, and a faded daguerreotype of a young woman teaching frontier. Children, all artifacts of the belief that every child deserves a chance to learn, to grow, and to dream of a future limited only by their willingness to work toward it. Charlotte Van Buren Ramsey would spend the rest of her life ensuring that belief became reality for generation after generation of children who might otherwise have been forgotten by a world focused on progress at any cost. It was, she often reflected, exactly the life her mother would have chosen, and exactly the legacy she wanted to leave behind.